Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to this next session of the Women's Forum here in Paris. It's all about how culture and technology can work together successfully, and how technology can help culture become more inclusive. If I could get everyone to be seated and if we could have a little bit of silence in the room so we can get started on this next session. Thank you. Thank you. So just to begin this session, I wanted to take 1 minute of your time before moving on to my esteemed panelists with a little anecdote. I write on culture for the New York Times, and I got an interview with the Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei about 2 years ago. And the interview took a while, it took about an hour and a half. And about towards the end of the interview, Ai Weiwei turned to me, and I was sitting opposite him with my little notebook and my tape recorder, and he did this. He lifted his camera and his phone. And I just thought, is he reading emails? Am I that boring? And actually then I realized, no, he's doing something else. And I said, are you taking my picture? And he looked, oh, yes, yes, he said, I'm sorry, yes, I am. Do you mind? And I thought for a second, and I thought, do I mind being photographed by one of the most popular living artists? And is this going to ever happen to me again? So, of course, I said, no, I don't mind. So I thought it was a picture just for him. But no, the picture ended up on his Instagram account. We have a lady here from Instagram who you'll be hearing from, Amina, in a few minutes. And the picture, and he's got 341,000 followers now. I don't know how many he had then, but was close. And so somebody kind of, because he didn't put a caption, looked at the picture and said, who is this lady? And the story that I'm telling is basically about the engagement of artists with the digital tool. And so if you go on Ai Weiwei's Instagram page, which is open to all, anyone can follow it, anyone can look at it, you will see that he has actually been putting a lot of photos of reporters in the last few days. So, you know, I thought I was special, evidently not. So basically, all of this to say, technology is revolutionizing culture, and it's being embraced by some of the world's most prominent and important artists. But it's also being embraced by some of the world's most prominent and important cultural institutions, representatives of which we happen to have up here on the podium today. Sitting next to me, to my immediate right, is Laurence Descartes, who is president of the Musée d'Orsay and the Musée de l'Orangerie in Paris. Next to her, we have Karen Wong, who is deputy director of the new museum in New York. Then we have Jude Kelly, who is the artistic director of the South Bank Centre in London, which consists of the Royal Festival Hall, the Hayward Gallery, Queen Elizabeth Hall. So then we have Christelle Rivail-Schubert, who is Google's marketing director for Southern Europe, so Google represented here today, of course. And last but not least, we have Amina Belghiti, who is Instagram's head of partnerships. So I thought I'd get this started by turning to Laurence and saying, Laurence, I mean, you've been in the job since March.
Yes.
And one of the things that you've really decided on, among the first you've decided on, is this 5-year strategy for digital engagement and social media. Mm-hmm. I mean, why is digital and social media important to the Musée d'Orsay and the Musée de l'Orangerie?
Well, let me answer that. First, I'm not a tech person. I'm just an art historian who got very lucky in this story. And the fact is that it's just part of our lives. It's just, you know, we are all surrounded, we are all using digital devices all day long. And museums are not, they're not cut from the society, and they're not cut from real life. They are part of real life. I do believe this very, very strongly. The experience that we have with works of art, even if they belong to the past, and in Orsay and Orangerie, we are dealing with mostly dead artists, you know, and for quite a long time. So
and dead white ones. Usually.
And dead white ones too.
Yeah.
Well, and a few women, and not so many diversity, I must say, but it's okay. Yeah. You know, we deal with it, but you know, it's part of the common experience. So the big question for national institution or heritage institution like Orsay and Orangerie is, what do we bring to our visitors, to the people who know, who don't know Orsay and Orangerie, through the digital experience, inside the museum but outside the museum. It's also the idea of the immaterial museum also, which is a very interesting question for people who are dealing with works of art and material questions also all day long, you know. And I really think that it's at the heart of our mission. It's not the only mission, but it's what is at the heart of this vision for digital technology inside Art Museum is the fact that it helps us imagining new ways of sharing and transmitting this heritage. And this is the top priority of any, you know, cultural institution today, is to transmit to younger generation and to all the public, you know, that is around us, a potential public, people who are sometimes away from the cultural world. And digital technology can obviously very much help this, you know.
Speaking of engaging with and sharing, you're basically creating a youth website.
Yes, we are
in 2018.
working.
Can
yes,
you talk a little bit about what this youth website will be?
The idea is very basic. Youth is really at the heart of my project for Orsay and Orangerie, and families also. You know, the thing that you share with families, an extended vision of family, but you know, the interaction between adults and children it's so important. It's at the heart, you know, of this transmission of heritage. So the idea of this website is really to allow kids to really take control of a collection, basically, and
design their own tour.
Design their own tour, design their own exhibition, choose, you know, the pictures of a sculpture that they prefer, of a photograph, and do, you know, imagine things with it and get information also, you know, about it, you know, and a little bit of learning, you know, is of course part of the experience. But I think it's one of the tools. It's not the only, of course, it's not the only way of doing it, but it helps again get the kids, you know, closer to the work of art and give them probably, I hope so, you know, the will to go to the museum also and to experience the real thing. I do not see separation between.
Can you illustrate? Like, if I'm a kid and I'm 8 years old, I will go on the site of Musée d'Orsay and pick, you know, a Renoir and a Van Gogh and say, this is my personal tour.
This is my personal tour, and I want to do my personal exhibition. I want to paint the wall blue or, you know, red with, I don't know, dots, the yellow dots. And I want to do my own show with it. And I want to tell my own story. I can tell my own stories about also a Van Gogh portrait or a landscape by Monet. And I can interact with adults or kids around me and share this. And go back to the museum maybe with them also in order to be in contact with the real thing. And this is my picture. This is my Van Gogh, you know. This belongs to me too. This is very, very important, you know.
Absolutely.
Cut the distance between younger generation to this heritage. It belongs to everyone. We are a national collection. We are, in a way, a universal museum because we are visited by, you know, all kind of people, different nationalities from all over the world. And the big question is, again, sharing and transmitting the love, the interest, the excitement, whatever you think about these works of art. So digital is definitely part of a journey, you know.
Speaking of digital journey, we move on to Karen Wong of the New Museum. Karen, your museum was one of the very first to have an all-photo policy, so which means basically you could photograph any exhibition more or less in your museum. Yes. And my question is, and this is something I could have asked Laurence as well, I mean, you run museums, and yet you're allowing people to take pictures of pretty much everything. How did that work?
Well, when we reopened the museum on the Bowery at the end of 2007, we're talking about the time when Facebook and Twitter were incredibly relevant, prevalent.
Closer.
Closer, okay,
yeah.
Great. And so we became very aware of, you know, this idea of sharing. So we thought, wow, let's take a risk and look at this idea of can we open up this photo policy? There was a lot of discussion. it was something like, oh my gosh, are we going to lose admissions because now we're sharing and nobody has to come and see the exhibit? But what was terrific about it is because we are a smaller museum, because we're under the radar, if the Musée d'Orsay or the Met were to say, oh, we're going to try an open photo policy, you'd get a story in the New York Times and everybody would be monitoring it, right? So in our case, we quietly did this for a couple of our opening exhibitions. And what we saw was, again, this engagement where people were learning about our exhibition through their Facebook networks. And now fast forward to 2017. This is pervasive globally. You've had these horrible stories when people are taking photographs and bumping into artwork and unfortunately damaging. But when it's done right and you have very disciplined visitors, it's terrific. We just had Pipilotti Rist, an artist very well known in Europe, not so much in New York City. So someone who does not have name recognition. And this was this immersive, stunning, both video with a lot of LED lights, and it was incredibly picturesque. We call it, fodder for Instagram. And that show became the most popular show in our history, #1, female artist, thank you, the most popular show in our history of 40 years. It was also the most shared exhibition. So there is actually a correlation that is the opposite of the myth that the more you share actually can increase visitorship.
Great, and one other thing, you're actually building a free mobile app for which 6 artists are going to make 6 works of virtual reality.
We actually did it already. So one of the things we pride ourselves is that we're nimble, and obviously everyone's talking about virtual reality. So in 2015, we were one of the first museums in the United States to have a virtual reality project done by an artist. So we thought, how can we expand? How do we make it more accessible? Virtual reality as a presentation still is lagging. It's one at a time. It can take quite a while. It's very fidgety. So we said, can we build a bespoke mobile app that you can download for free, which you can do on your iPhone or Android? It's called First Look AR. VR, First Look VR. And we commissioned 6 artists who were already working in virtual reality to create new works of art. And essentially you can be at home with a pair of Google Cardboards and start to experience this kind of work that many artists are very, very interested in.
Jude, you run, as I was mentioning earlier, the South Bank Centre in London, which is a multi-arts complex consisting of the Royal Festival Hall. I'm sure all of you have been to concerts there. The Hayward Gallery, prominent exhibition gallery, and the Queen Elizabeth Hall. So classical music, jazz, world music, visual arts, some dance, and some literature talks. And I'm sure I'm missing, oh yes, and of course, most important, a lot of themed festivals take place at the South Bank Centre under the aegis of Jude. So I recently visited your website, and you really jazzed it up. I mean, I invite you all to go to southbankcentre.co.uk, I think it is, and it is just really so incredibly modern and, engaging, and sort of invites you in. So you're obviously paying a lot of attention to digital, and why is digital important to you?
Well, I think what Lawrence and Karen and I would say is that it isn't that digital per se is important. It's that changing the nature of who owns the arts is important. And digital is a method by which you can do it. In the end, all humans tell stories, and some of those stories get formalized into works of art. And the history of art is that those stories that are championed have tended to be stories that have been created by one group of people. They're the ones that are championed. There are millions of stories that could have been told, but the ones that have got through. And as a result, we can't deny the fact that many people would view the arts as not for them. They don't see themselves included. The women feel that men make art. Women have less confidence about the idea that they are a creative center themselves. And many people of color, people with disability, you know, anybody who feels is on the margins of the centre will say that art is not necessarily for them. And yet, the history of art shows us that it's the unique story of the artist, often from the outside, that will change the nature of art making. So I think that the push from our side is to say, when we're trying to talk about inclusive arts for an inclusive society, the title, we're not trying to say, look, could we include you all in what we're already doing? We're trying to say, how do we change what we're doing so that it includes you? And that really, in my experience, has been incredibly speeded up by the opportunity to use technology. Because as you know, Lawrence and Karen were saying, it means that people can own the means of production. They can say, this is my story, this is how I want to tell it. Even if I want to distort somebody else's story, I will, you know, this is obviously a lot of what in music, you know, when DJs were scratching, when they were creating homages or pastiches of classical form, they were putting their own story on top of it. So, you know, some art forms are very frightened of being invaded, as they see it, by other stories. And some art forms are really open to it. I mean, so contemporary music can tell many, many stories from many different voices. Classical music has a very, very clear European Western heritage. And in order to change that, you have to give people the opportunity, and it's best done through technology, I think, to access ideas and say, well, how would you work on those ideas to produce the art of tomorrow? So
how do you do that? I mean, how do you engage with your audience? I mean, can you give me an example of where the audience has decided on what you program?
I mean, you know, by the way, you know, there's obviously
no, we're not going that far.
There's obviously all the conventional things we want to say. What we're already doing, you use technology to advertise, you use technology to sell tickets. I mean, but that's all business as usual. But in terms of the idea of what's an inclusive society, then examples of what we do. Well, we will, through technology, give people the individual strands of the orchestra, each instrument by instrument, and with small ideas of composition, and then say, how would you use this to tell your story? And they will send back in, you know, all different kinds of compositions, and then the compositions will form live streaming for lots of different kinds of ideas. I mean, there are lots of ways of doing this. In literature, of course, we're very aware now that the spoken word poetry is a stand for people being able to change the nature of literature and make it something that is much more related to the original oral tradition. And that is making it possible to change the art. So we're looking all the time for how do you support and continue to pay homage to the canon, which is, I suppose, how, you know, the West has built up its notion of civilization. But how do you put that in parallel with all the stories that have been forgotten, the art forms that are less treasured but should be, and the art forms yet to come?
Great. I would like to now ask a question of Christelle. Christelle is with Google, and I don't know if any of you have been to see the Google Arts and Culture website. It basically offers virtual visits to many, many of the world's major museums and cultural institutions, including Orsay? Including Musée d'Orsay. So you can go to Google and you can visit these places without actually being there. And the other thing that is intriguing is that it seems to me that Google is sort of digitizing museums and art the way that it sort of digitized books, but I don't know if that's a good parallel. And I'm just wondering why Google has sort of chosen to do this.
So that's a great question. At the heart of Google, we're all about, you know, accessibility of information. So we really want everyone to have access to information wherever they live, however little money they have. As long as you have an internet connection, you can access information. And then we realized people had access to information, but not so much to arts and culture in general. Because to have access to arts and culture, it was better if actually you had some money, you lived in a larger city, you had the right socioeconomic background that, you know, you knew that you could go to a museum, would have the appetite and stuff. So we started this project about 6 years ago, right? Started an arts project in Spain, actually, working with a museum and say, okay, why don't we try and bring this museum's artworks online to be available to everyone, right? So fast forward 6 years later, now we have over 1,500 partners all over the world. And we work with
We're
them.
seeing some images, actually, by
Yeah,
the way,
so-
of the Google Arts and Culture site, in case you're wondering
exactly.
what's coming on your screen.
We're just a tool, we're a platform, but the idea was really about enabling anyone, really anyone, like especially like, kids, teens, teachers. Someone mentioned earlier with a Google Cardboard, teachers taking their classroom on a visit. I've done it. I've taken my kids to a visit of Versailles with a cardboard at home, which is nice as a prelude to the actual visit, right, on a sunny day. And that gives accessibility to arts and culture, to people that otherwise, honestly, wouldn't necessarily have the means or the appetite.
And so how is that really working? I mean, if we pitch into the future, and this is a question I might be asking some of the other ladies up here. I mean, are museums going to disappear, or, more short term, is this not going to kind of cannibalize the audience of people who will actually go to the physical museums?
So that's a great question, and honestly, that's a question we had a lot at the start when we started actually talking to museum. Actually, we've seen it doesn't cannibalize at all, right? Actually, it's, we've seen not only the online traffic going up, but actually the visits going up, and I don't think Musée d'Orsay can say that they've lost any traffic. I think it's really a way for people to prepare the visit. It's also a way for people that are abroad to actually access stuff. Not every, interestingly, if we look at the top countries of people that visit the website, we have lots of visits from, Iran, from Malaysia, from South Korea. I mean, how many of these people would actually go to Musée d'Orsay on a regular basis? Not many. We also have lots of people from the US, France, the UK, Germany, who are maybe slightly more likely to be able to visit, right? So I think that's really important, because we're just here to help museum, right? It's something, we don't make any money out of it, nor do the museum. So we're here to help. If that didn't help the museum and cultural institution, they wouldn't have joined the project, right?
I'm curious, actually, I'm originally from Iran, so I was just curious, do you know which site or museum the Iranians visit?
I know, I could find out. I don't have the data. But I found that very interesting, because about inclusivity, for us, it's a lot about representing, so it's arts and culture, not just arts, right? It's culture in a broader sense, from all over the globe, and we try to make sure that all minorities are well represented. So we did lots of stuff around, like, for example, women in India. We did some stuff about Hispanic heritage, Black History Month in the US. I mean, trying to make sure it's very diverse in terms of culture, but also having people across it globally, right? So, people from Iran might check Musée d'Orsay, but they might actually check, museum and collection in the US, so.
Of course. And Amina, we're finally going to speak to you about Instagram and the role that it plays. We were mentioning earlier about Ai Weiwei's account. You said you thought that somehow art and culture sometimes felt a little bit exclusive. Can you talk about that and about how Instagram is trying to break down barriers?
Absolutely. I think that's right. The arts have often felt like a closed circle, a bit of an exclusive club. And very few people got to decide whose story got told, which stories actually got exposure to a wide audience. And I think what's interesting with technology and with social media and Instagram in particular is that you're giving the tools to artists, but to people generally, to tell their own story. And in democratizing access and being able essentially to tell your own story, you've kind of changed the dynamic a little bit. And that's important for a few reasons. One, because obviously it makes it more inclusive, but I think more importantly, it allows you to then reach out to a community of people around shared interests, around shared causes in general. And artists do that very, very well. We're seeing that a lot on Instagram. So young social rights activists, for example, being able to reach out to their community and create a following around a particular issue or cause. There's a great example of a young artist in Amsterdam who created an account on Instagram called Dear Catcallers. And her account every day posts a selfie of herself with these men who have been catcalling and harassing her. And it's her way of, she's a young artist, and it's her way of taking control back and being able to share that more broadly. And she's now handing over the reins of that account to a few other women around the world to be able to tell their story. And we hear these stories over and over again. It's quite inspiring, to be honest, to be able to have, an account like this one in Amsterdam. From the day it started to now, it's 40,000 people now following and hearing this woman talk about this particular issue. There's another great example in Cape Town. Roads Must Fall is a movement that started a few years ago, and in opposition, essentially, to the statue of Cecil Rhodes that sat in the middle of the University of Cape Town. And this young artist, Sitimbele Mezene, decided to actually take that back into her own hands. And she decided to actually stand where statues would be. She was the living statue, dressed in sort of symbolic costumes and telling the story and claiming the spaces of the University of Cape Town, of the city of Cape Town, and in that way helping to kind of decolonize education and more generally her experience of the city.
Great. So I think we're going to broaden things a little bit because this is the Women's Forum, and we happen to have 3 women leading major cultural institutions in the Western world. I wanted to turn to each of you, Laurence, Karen, and Jude, and sort of ask you how women could be brought in more to doing what it is that you do, and how women could be actually using their platform to make the arts more inclusive. You want to take, whoever wants to take that.
I can jump in first. You know, particularly in New York City right now, the idea of female directors has just been such a huge story. The New York Times writes about it almost on a weekly basis. Will we have a first female director of the Met Museum? So it's on everybody's minds. But I want to turn back to 2 panels ago where we talked about the Rooney Law in the FNL, the Football League in America, where essentially about 20 years ago, when they lacked African-American coaches, they made it a rule that you had to at least interview an African-American coach, and so in a very rapid time. So different museums have now not done it officially, but I think a lot of us are looking at making sure that when we're hiring, we are looking people of color, definitely female, has to be in the interview pool. You don't have to hire, but you have to get into that. We have to, as people have been saying, you have to change the cultural biases, and you have to make new modes of operation. So that's certainly one way. And certainly when you are in a position of leadership, you have to mentor your female staff. You have to look out for them. You have to get them their next job at a bigger museum. And it's really kind of on the ground mentoring like that I think is going to really change the game eventually for us.
I think Jude organizes a festival called the Women of the World. And Jude, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it's an illusion to think that we are the first generation of female leaders running major institutions. I mean, it is part of the problem of women's history, and the part of the problem even of Wikipedia, that 92% of entries on Wikipedia are about men by men, and we've got to do something about that. So that's up to us. We've got to get into Wikipedia and change history to what it actually already is, never mind what it could be. The fact is that even in my country, and I can't speak for France, the Royal Ballet was started by Nanette de Valois, the Romberg Company was started by Barry Romberg, Lillian Bayliss started up the National Theatre in the Old Vic. I mean, I could go on and on and on. The fact is that great women with ability have often managed to push through because of their determination, but the difference is that if they're in a society that is still abiding by all the rigorous rules of patriarchy, they have to fall away again. They won't create a critical mass. And I think that women who have got to the top have often felt in order to stay at the top and in order to be seen as legitimate, they had to not champion women, because that looked like they were sort of sticking up for an unfashionable cause. When I joined South Bank Centre, which is over 10 years ago now, I sort of looked around at everything I was curating, and I realized that I was in danger of carrying on supporting the idea that male creativity was the thing that was the most important thing to champion. And so I started the WOW Festival, the Women of the World Festival, and it's in 23 countries now, which is fantastic. But when I started it, actually, to be honest, I was personally quite frightened, because I felt as if I was going to be sort of criticized as a woman for being on women's sides. I mean, I'd always been on women's side, but I mean, to be absolutely out there about it. Now, a lot has changed in 7 years in societies, and these forums that we've got like today are a product of people saying, unless you change the whole conversation about women in society, people like us will come and go in history over and over again. So we have to be part of a whole movement, which we are, to say that gender equality is about changing everybody's conversation, not just women in the arts or women in law or women in health. It's all of us together. That is when we'll be here to stay.
Laurence,
Yes,
you're one of the
completely
women at the top,
yeah.
so what do you think?
No, I completely share what has just been said, and especially the fact that we are not the first women to run an important position in the cultural world. It's very true in France too, but the history is somehow discontinued. And I see from the generation to you know, I'm the second woman to run Orsay in 30 years. After Françoise Cachin, who was the first director of Orsay. And it says a lot, you know. You had to add 30 years between two women to run Orsay, you know. And so it says a lot about this discontinuity, and I share your really what you just said. What you just said also is very important about monitoring of a woman. And when you're in a position of making a difference, make the difference immediately. And I'm very proud to have hired a woman to be my successor as the director of Orangerie, and to have hired a woman to be the director for collection and curatorial affairs in Orsay. So those two museums are run now by 3 women, you know. And this is really a statement for my part, not a really political one probably, but it's a strong statement about saying, you know, there are a lot of women art historians, curators in this world, but not many women who run institutions. So let's do it. When we can do it, let's do it. Let's do it cleverly, let's do it, you know, strongly, but let's do it.
Great. I think we're going to be counting down to the end of this session in about 9 minutes. But so what I wanted to wrap up is to ask each of you to sort of tell me, and we're starting with Amina, how you think that going forward we could be more inclusive in the cultural world. What are some of your ideas and prescriptions?
Sure. So I think to me, inclusivity in the arts is really not about having more people see a show, or at least it's not just about that. I think it's really about giving artists and people the tools to engage, to challenge, to interact, to really engage on a radically new level. And to me, the thing that sort of makes the difference here is that technology, as you were saying, Jude, is just a tool. And in a lot of ways, it is most effective when it takes a little bit of a step back and allows people to showcase their own stories. And that's really what I think will make the difference. To me, what I would love to see going forward, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, this idea that artists are telling their stories, that they're building communities around specific issues and questions that they care about, but being able to turn the commissioning model on its head, right? What if you actually had a group of high school students in Marrakesh commissioning Ai Weiwei or William Kentridge for a piece? What if you were able to you know, have a group of women in Cairo who are concerned about taking public transportation, reaching out to Shireen Nishat to actually have her share a piece in that space? So to me, it's about turning it around, allowing people to really engage with art in a slightly different way, and actually calling it in, as opposed to have more of a top-down model, which is what we've seen to date.
Thank you. What about you, Christelle? What is your recommendation for the future?
I think, I mean, and some of you alluded, I think Jude especially, I think it's really about role models. I think what we see a lot amongst minorities and women, because I don't like to call women minority, right? Is that, you know, they don't put themselves forward as much, right? Because if you don't have a role model, you don't feel like you're entitled or you're legitimate, right, to be there. So I think everything we can do to show role models, it can be artists, it can be cultural, political figures. I mean, everything we can do to actually showcase them. I think the Wikipedia example was like spot on, right? So everything we can do to just show diversity, and diversity and inclusivity is not only like color or gender stuff, it's also point of view, right? So everything we can do to promote that and give these role models so that the younger generation will feel like it's fine, it's okay for them to share. And they are a generation which is very comfortable actually, you know, sharing and broadcasting themselves, and we see that on YouTube, for example, or Instagram, or any platform. So how can we help them and give them a voice?
Jude, can you talk about not just gender? I mean, how can we be inclusive through digital, social, gender, whatever it is?
Well, I mean, obviously, one of the things that, with one exception, is that, you know, there's 4 white Caucasian women, 1 Asian woman, no black women, and I think that it is one of the great problems of our societies that the model of power, and obviously we talk in the women's movement a lot about patriarchy, but white supremacy is another model, heterosexual dominance is another model, and all of these things inevitably are reflected in how art organizes itself, and therefore what we're telling people to appreciate. And I think you've got a panel of people who all agree with each other, and that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned, because it means you've got a critical mass of people who want that to change. And I think it isn't just about including women into the same way of telling the story. It's actually this whole word, I don't know whether it's been used a lot today, but intersectionality. I mean, the intersections between different kinds of parts of society and different parts of the world, and giving equal value. It's something we find so hard to do. It's not the way we've been taught history. It's not the way that we've been taught self-identity. But I think that is what has to change. Because even though a lot of you probably aren't in the arts, in the end, civilizations use the arts as their sort of final linchpin of saying, this is who we are, or this is who we were. So it's so important, because if the trail of history says, well, who we were was always finally male and white, then that will carry on the power structure forever in that way in the arts. So the arts, I mean, you said it's not political. It is political, but with a small p. It is political, and I'm sure you meant that really. Yeah. It's about radical change in the way that we think about the purpose of the art, and who makes art, who should be valued in those stories, and who's entitled.
So I'm going to follow up with Jude, because you have kind of given me the framework, and I'm going to put a little meat onto that in terms of what the new museum is hoping to do. We started an incubator called New Inc. 4 years ago. It's at the intersection of art, design, and technology. And what we're really trying to say is that the definition of artists is growing. And we're also looking at incubator spaces to nurture these artists. And we have made a very deliberate choice to curate people that are not only these hybrid characters and don't fit into these verticals that we so typically think about what an artist is, but it's also an incubator that is more than 50% women, which, focused on tech is incredibly rare, and we're 40% people of color. So we are exactly trying to do what you're saying, is to create a society, a community that is reflective of the demographic of New York, and we hope through our helping them have sustainable practices, businesses, platforms. They've gone on to create another couple hundred jobs. So, this is the type of vehicles we need to start thinking about, also being outside of the box. Museums, we have such brand cachet. You have millions of people who listen to you, and you have a voice where you can really change the game, you can pivot. So it's a very exciting time being able to use technology to change narratives.
So Laurence, you have millions of people listening to you, is that true?
Every day, every morning.
What are your thoughts?
No, but for museums like Orsay and Orangerie, who are dealing with heritage questions more than contemporary artists and contemporary creation, the thing is to really open those institutions to diverse voices, and people from all origin, not only contemporary artists, but it could be thinkers, it could be writers, it could be, everyone.
How do you do that at Orsay?
You can have special programs, and we are working on this, to have sort of the term of ambassador is a bit maybe too fancy, but it's or too sophisticated. It should be, have other voices than the curators, other voices than the art historian or the specialist, but people who could connect with the reality of society, of French society today, who can be really, talk about the works of art they love, or talk about anything dealing with Orsay or Orangerie. And I really do believe that this opening up of the institution, including debates, including maybe sometimes, questions that can really make debate in society, is extremely important. We are not only about being expert on heritage and show beautiful things that are admired all around the world. We are a museum for today and for today's people. So we should be open to this, and it's one of my ambitions as president of Orsay and Angers.
Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted you to join me in thanking my panelists, my excellent panelists this afternoon, and it's been a wonderful session. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.